Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're heading north, way north, to a place where the sky stretches wider than anywhere else you've ever been. A place where mountains rise like ancient sentinels and the wind carries stories from 150 years ago. We're rolling into Montana, friends. Big sky country. The land that time forgot, or maybe the land that time remembered a little too well. Get yourself comfortable, settle in, and let's ride. There's something about crossing into Montana that changes you. Maybe it's the way the landscape opens up, like the earth itself is taking a deep breath. Maybe it's how the sky seems to go on forever, stretching from horizon to horizon without a single thing to interrupt it, except maybe a cloud or two drifting by like they've got all the time in the world. Or maybe it's just knowing you're in a place where the rules are a little different, where the land still calls the shots, and where a man behind the wheel can find a kind of freedom that's getting harder to find these days. I've driven through Montana more times than I can count. Crossed it east to west on Interstate 90, a ribbon of asphalt that runs 552 miles through the heart of the state, the longest single-state stretch of I-90 in the entire country. I've taken Interstate 15 north from Idaho all the way to the Canadian border, watching the Rockies rise and fall like waves frozen in stone. I've rolled along U.S. Route 2, what the locals call the High Line, parallel to Canada, through towns so small you might miss them if you blink, but each one with a story worth telling if you take the time to stop and listen. Montana's the fourth largest state in the Union, spanning nearly 147,000 square miles. But here's the thing that gets you. It's got barely over 1 million people living in all that space. That's the third lowest population density in the country. You can drive for an hour and not see another soul. Just you, the road, and that big Montana sky pressing down on you like it's trying to remind you how small you really are in the grand scheme of things. For a trucker, Montana is both a blessing and a challenge. The roads are long and lonely, but they're also beautiful in a way that makes you remember why you started driving in the first place. The weather can turn on a dime. You might start your day in sunshine and end it in a blizzard, even in May or September. The wind comes howling across those plains like it's got a personal vendetta against anything on wheels. But when conditions are good, when that sky is clear and that road is straight, there's no better place to be. The state breaks down into two distinct regions, and you feel the difference in your bones as you drive. The western 2/5 belong to the Rocky Mountains, all peaks and valleys and forests so thick with pine and spruce you can smell them from the highway. This is where you'll find Glacier National Park, where glaciers that have been around for 7,000 years are slowly melting away, reminders that even mountains aren't forever. The eastern 3/5 spread out into the Great Plains, rolling grasslands dotted with cattle and grain fields, where the wind never stops and the horizon seems to mock the very idea of boundaries. Montana means mountain in Spanish, borrowed from the Spanish phrase Montaña del Norte, that early explorers used for the whole mountainous western region of North America. But here's the irony. Montana's got an average elevation of only 3,400 feet, the lowest among all the mountain states. It's the contrasts that define this place. Mountains in the west, plains in the east. Forests thick with shadow, grasslands bright with sun. Small towns that feel frozen in 1950, and cities trying hard to step into the future without forgetting where they came from. The highways here were built for a different era, when the goal was to connect far-flung communities and open up the frontier to commerce. Interstate 90 follows much of the old U.S. Route 10 corridor, itself tracing paths that native peoples and fur trappers used centuries before. These aren't just roads. They're lifelines through a landscape that can be unforgiving to those who don't respect it. And believe me, after you've driven through a Montana winter, with snow coming at your windshield like horizontal missiles and ice building up on your mirrors, you learn respect real quick. But tonight, we're not just here to talk about driving. We're here to dig into the stories, the history, the legends that still float around these parts like ghosts refusing to rest. Montana's got tales that'll raise the hair on the back of your neck and make you check your rearview mirror a little more often than usual. It's got places where the past feels so present you'd swear you could reach out and touch it. And it's got mysteries, the kind that don't have easy answers, tucked away in ghost towns and battlefield markers and mountain passes that have seen more than their share of tragedy. So let's roll. Let's see what Montana has to show us. Before there were highways, before there were wagon trails, before there were even horses brought by Spanish conquistadors, people walked this land. The archaeological record shows human presence in Montana going back about 12,000 years, maybe more. These were the Paleo-Indians, the first peoples to cross from Asia into North America at the end of the last ice age, when a land bridge connected the continents. They followed the great herds of mammals, hunting mammoth and bison, living in a landscape that would have been unrecognizable to us now. Near a town called Wilsall in south-central Montana, archaeologists found what they call the Anzac Site, where the remains of a male infant were discovered and carbon dated to somewhere between 11,000 and 13,000 years old. It's the oldest dated human burial site in North America. Think about that for a moment. While civilizations were just beginning to form in the Fertile Crescent on the other side of the world, people were living and dying and burying their dead with care right here on these Montana plains. By the time Europeans started poking around in the 1700s, the land was home to numerous Native American tribes, each with their own territories, their own ways of life, their own relationships with the land that sustained them. In the Plains region, you had the Blackfeet, one of the most powerful tribes, ranging across what would become northern Montana and southern Canada. The Crow occupied south-central Montana, skilled horsemen and warriors who called the Yellowstone River Valley home. The Cheyenne held the southeastern corner. The Assiniboine and Gros Ventre lived in the northeast. In the mountains to the west, the tribes lived differently. The Kootenai and Salish, or Flathead, made their homes in valleys and along rivers, building more permanent structures, gathering roots and berries, fishing the cold mountain streams. They traveled seasonally, following the rhythms of the land, crossing the continental divide to hunt buffalo on the plains, then returning to the shelter of the mountains when winter came. These weren't simple people living simple lives, no matter what some of the early white explorers might have thought. They had complex social structures, rich spiritual traditions, detailed knowledge of the land that would put most modern folks to shame. The Blackfeet called the area around what's now Glacier National Park the backbone of the world. And they had stories about Nappy, the trickster spirit who created everything. Going to the Sun Mountain, which now gives its name to the famous road through Glacier, was sacred to them. They told of Sour Spirit, a being from the Lodge of the Sun who came down to teach them how to hunt, and when he returned to the sun, he left his face imprinted on that mountain as inspiration. Then came the Europeans. French fur trappers started showing up in the 1700s, though exactly when is hard to pin down. They weren't interested in settling. They wanted beaver pelts, which were worth a fortune back in Europe where beaver hats were all the rage. They set up trading posts, married into native tribes, learned the languages and the land. The relationship was complicated, sometimes cooperative, sometimes exploitative, but it changed things. The fur trade brought new goods, but it also brought alcohol and disease and a commercial mindset that clashed with the native way of seeing the world. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 put most of Montana under United States ownership, though the people living there probably didn't feel like much had changed. But then came Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1804, part of President Thomas Jefferson's grand expedition to map and understand this vast territory the country had just bought from France for $15 million, basically a real estate deal of continental proportions. Lewis and Clark entered Montana in April 1805, following the Missouri River. They spent more time in Montana than in any other present-day state during their journey, crossing and recrossing the land from east to west. They met with the Salish and Shoshone people. Sacagawea, their Shoshone guide and interpreter, had been kidnapped from her people years earlier and sold to a French-Canadian trader. When they reached Shoshone territory, she found herself face to face with her own brother, who had become a chief. It's the kind of moment that reminds you history isn't just dates and events. It's people, with all their complicated emotions and unexpected reunions and heartbreaks. When Lewis and Clark returned east and spread word about the abundant wildlife, the thick forests, the clear rivers teeming with beaver, it kicked off a fur trading boom. Trappers and traders flooded in. Fort Benton was established in 1846 by the American Fur Trading Company on the Missouri River, and it became a major hub. For decades, it was the westernmost navigable point on the Missouri, which meant anything coming into Montana by boat had to come through Fort Benton. The town called itself the birthplace of Montana, and that's not too far from the truth. But the fur trade was always going to be temporary. By the 1840s, beaver populations had been decimated, and besides, fashion had moved on. The tall beaver hat went out of style. Silk was in. Just like that, the economic engine that had driven white presence in Montana sputtered and died. The trappers moved on or settled down. The trading posts closed or adapted. And the land went back to being relatively quiet, at least as far as white settlement was concerned. The native peoples, meanwhile, were watching as more and more outsiders arrived. Catholic missionaries came in the wake of the fur traders, trying to save souls and establish churches. Settlers started eyeing the fertile valleys for farming, and pressure was building, the kind of pressure that would explode in the 1860s and change everything forever. In 1862, everything changed for Montana when gold was discovered along Grasshopper Creek, near what would become Bannack. Word spread fast the way it always does when there's money to be made, and suddenly people were pouring in from all directions. Miners, prospectors, merchants, gamblers, con artists, prostitutes, anyone who thought they could make a fortune or at least a living off those who were trying to. Within a year, Bannack had 3,000 people. At its peak, maybe 10,000 souls called it home, though home might be too generous a word for the rough camps and hastily built shacks that made up most of the town. Bannack became Montana's first territorial capital in 1864, though it only held that distinction for a year before the capital moved to Virginia City, where even more gold had been found. These were boom towns in every sense of the word. They boomed into existence practically overnight. 3 hotels, 3 bakeries, 2 stables, 4 saloons. The saloons always came first, it seemed. Wherever men gathered to dig in the dirt and dream of riches, someone was there ready to sell them whiskey and empty their pockets in other ways. But boom towns have a dark side. With no established law, no courts, no system of justice, places like Bannack and Virginia City became havens for outlaws. The trail between Bannack and Virginia City, with stages carrying gold and supplies, was prime hunting ground for road agents, bandits who robbed and killed travelers. Estimates vary, but by fall of 1863, over 100 people had been murdered along that route. Here's where the story gets interesting, the kind of twist that would feel too convenient if you read it in a novel. Bannack elected a sheriff in 1863, a man named Henry Plummer. Handsome, well-dressed, charismatic, he seemed like exactly the kind of strong, capable man who could bring order to a lawless town. And for a while, maybe he did. But Plummer had a secret. He was the leader of a gang of road agents called the Innocents, and his position as sheriff gave him perfect inside information about who was traveling with gold when they were leaving, what route they'd take. The citizens of Bannack and Virginia City were being robbed and killed by the very man they'd hired to protect them. When the truth finally came out, or when the vigilantes decided they'd had enough and someone needed to pay, things moved fast. In late December 1863, a group of men calling themselves the Vigilance Committee of Alder Gulch formed in Virginia City. They rode into Bannack in January 1864, rounded up Plummer and two of his deputies, and hanged them without trial. Plummer's last words, allegedly, were a request for them to give him a good drop, meaning a clean break of the neck rather than slow strangulation. Over the next 6 weeks, the vigilantes hunted down 21 men they believed were part of the Innocents gang, stringing them up without benefit of judge or jury. Was Plummer really guilty? Were all those men they hanged actually bandits? Or did some innocent people get caught up in vigilante fervor and mob justice? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the killings stopped after the vigilantes did their work, and Montana Territory got a formal justice system later in 1864 that put an end to the lynch mob approach. While the gold rush towns were exploding in the southwest part of Montana, another kind of wealth was being discovered in the mountains. In the 1860s, prospectors found silver and copper near Butte. Silver was valuable, but copper would prove to be the real treasure, especially as the electrical age dawned, and copper wire became essential for everything from telegraph lines to power grids. By the 1880s, Butte was known as the richest hill on earth, and men like Marcus Dolly, W.A. Clark, and F. Augustus Hines, the so-called Copper Kings, were building empires and fighting vicious battles for control. Dolly founded the Anaconda Copper Mining Company and built the smelting town of Anaconda to process Butte's ore. The Anaconda smelter's smokestack stood 585 feet tall, one of the tallest freestanding brick structures in the world, visible for miles across the valley. The smelter spewed pollutants that devastated the landscape downwind, leaving it barren and toxic, but it also brought jobs and wealth. The Copper Kings influenced politics, newspapers, even which town would become the state capital. Clark used bribes and corruption to get himself elected to the U.S. Senate, a scandal so blatant it helped lead to the constitutional amendment allowing direct election of senators instead of appointment by state legislatures. Montana became a territory in 1864, carved out of Idaho Territory. For 25 years, it existed in that liminal state, part of the United States but not quite a state itself, governed by federally appointed officials but increasingly asserting its own identity. On November 8, 1889, Montana became the 41st state admitted to the Union, joining a wave of western states that included North and South Dakota and Washington. Statehood came with choices and compromises. Helena beat out Anaconda to become the permanent capital, largely thanks to Clark's money and influence. The state needed to figure out how to transition from a mining-dependent boom-and-bust economy to something more stable and sustainable. Cattle ranching had already taken off in the eastern part of the state, with vast herds grazing the open range. Agriculture was expanding wherever the climate and soil would allow it. The railroads were coming, iron roads that would make Montana's wealth easier to extract and ship to markets back east. But even as Montana was trying to build a future, it was also dealing with unfinished business from its past. The native tribes who had lived on this land for thousands of years weren't willing to simply disappear. They'd been promised treaties that were repeatedly broken. They'd been pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. They'd watched as white settlers slaughtered the buffalo herds that sustained them, killing the great beasts by the millions, leaving their bodies to rot on the prairie just for their hides or sometimes just for sport. In 1876, tensions exploded at a place called the Little Bighorn. It's a story everyone knows, at least the broad strokes. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry, about 260 soldiers, wiped out by combined forces of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Custer's last stand. The newspapers back east called it a massacre, but from the native perspective, it was a desperate defense of their way of life against an army that had been sent to force them onto reservations. The battle itself was brief and brutal. Custer divided his forces, underestimated his enemy, and paid for it with his life and the lives of every man under his direct command. The native victory was overwhelming, and for a moment it seemed like maybe they could turn back the tide. But it was a moment, nothing more. The U.S. government responded with overwhelming force, hunting down the tribes, and within a year, the Great Lakota and Cheyenne coalition had been broken. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse was killed while in custody. The buffalo were gone. The old way of life was finished. Today, 7 Native American reservations remain in Montana, including the Blackfeet Reservation, the Crow Reservation, the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and others. Together, they comprise about 8% of the state's land. The tribes are still there, still maintaining their cultures and languages and traditions as best they can, fighting different battles now, legal and political and economic, but fighting nonetheless. Montana's history is written in boom and bust, in fortunes made and lost, in the exploitation of land and people and resources. It's a complicated, messy, often brutal history, but it's the history that shaped the place, and you can still see its echoes everywhere you look. In the ghost towns scattered across the landscape, in the open pit mines that swallowed entire mountains, in the reservations where people worked to preserve what was almost destroyed, in the very roads we drive, built on trails that were old before the first white man ever saw these mountains. Montana's modern highway system tells its own story about how the state evolved and what it values. For decades, the roads were rough, often impassable in winter, more suggestions of routes than actual reliable infrastructure. U.S. Route 2, the High Line, was one of the first major east-west roads across northern Montana, roughly paralleling the Canadian border. It passes through towns like Havre and Glasgow, communities that grew up around the railroad and needed roads to connect them to the rest of Montana and the country. But the real transformation came with the Interstate highway system, a massive federal project launched in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. The idea was to create a network of high-speed, limited-access highways that would facilitate commerce, allow for rapid military mobilization if needed, and connect the nation in a way it had never been connected before. For Montana, this meant Interstate 90 cutting across the southern part of the state and Interstate 15 running north-south through the western mountains. Interstate 90 enters Montana from Idaho at Lookout Pass, elevation 4,725 feet, in the Bitterroot Range of the Rockies. From there, it descends following the St. Regis River through forested mountains, passing through towns like St. Regis and Superior before reaching Missoula, Montana's second-largest city. Missoula sits in a valley where 5 mountain ranges converge, a natural crossroads that's been important for thousands of years. The university is there, giving the town a cultural and intellectual vibe that's different from the more industrial or agricultural centers elsewhere in the state. From Missoula, I-90 continues southeast, paralleling the Clark Fork River for a while before turning south toward Butte. This stretch takes you through country that's absolutely stunning when the weather's clear. Mountains rise on both sides, forests thick with pine and fir, and every now and then you'll catch glimpses of the old railroad grade running parallel to the highway, a reminder of how people moved through this country before the interstate. At Butte, I-90 meets Interstate 15, and the two highways run together for about 8 miles in what's called a concurrency. Butte's another place worth mentioning. It sits at elevation 5,800 feet, surrounded by mountains, and if you look close as you drive through, you can see the old mining works, the head frames of closed mines poking up like monuments to a past that's not quite gone. The Berkeley Pit, a massive open-pit copper mine that operated from 1955 to 1982, is now filled with toxic water, a surreal turquoise lake that's actually poisonous. It's become a weird tourist attraction, people paying to look at environmental disaster turned into spectacle. East of Butte, I-90 crosses the Continental Divide at Homestake Pass, elevation 6,329 feet. This is the highest point on the entire Interstate 90 system from Seattle to Boston, which makes it particularly interesting for truckers. In winter, this pass can be brutal. Snow, ice, wind, limited visibility. Even in good weather, you feel it in your truck. The way the engine works a little harder on the climb. The way you have to ride the brakes on the descent. There's an emergency escape ramp on the eastbound side for trucks that lose their brakes. A long uphill runoff lane filled with loose gravel designed to stop a runaway rig without killing the driver. Past the divide, you're heading down into the headwaters of the Missouri River system, a different watershed entirely. The landscape opens up a bit as you approach Bozeman, a college town that's grown rapidly in recent years, full of outdoor enthusiasts and tech workers who can work remotely and chose Montana for the lifestyle. From Bozeman, the highway crosses Bozeman Pass and then starts following the Yellowstone River, one of Montana's great waterways, flowing north and then east all the way to where it joins the Missouri in North Dakota. The stretch from Bozeman through Livingston to Billings is some of the most pleasant driving in Montana when conditions are good. Rolling hills, river valleys, mountains visible in the distance. You pass through Columbus and Laurel Ranch country where cattle outnumber people by a comfortable margin, before reaching Billings, Montana's largest city with about 110,000 people. Billings is where I-90 meets Interstate 94, which heads northeast toward Miles City and the eastern Montana plains. East of Billings, I-90 turns southeast, leaving the Yellowstone and cutting through the Crow Indian Reservation. This is where you'll pass near the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, site of Custer's last stand. The highway passes through Hardin and Crow Agency before finally crossing into Wyoming near the Montana-Wyoming border. All told, Interstate 90 runs 552 miles through Montana, the longest stretch of I-90 in any single state. It took decades to build, starting in the late 1950s and not completed until 1988. The entire interstate system in Montana cost about $1.22 billion to construct, and 95% of it serves rural areas, the highest proportion of any state in the interstate program. Interstate 15, meanwhile, runs north-south through western Montana. It enters from Idaho near Monada Pass, climbs through the mountains to Butte where it briefly joins I-90, then continues north to Helena, the state capital. Helena's got about 32,000 people, small for a capital city, but it's got history. It started as a gold mining camp called Last Chance Gulch in 1864, and some of the wealth from those mining days went into building Victorian mansions and an impressive state capitol building. From Helena, I-15 continues north past Great Falls, Montana's third largest city at about 60,000 people. Great Falls gets its name from a series of waterfalls on the Missouri River, though hydroelectric dams have tamed them now. Lewis and Clark spent nearly a month portaging around these falls in 1805, one of the toughest parts of their expedition. The highway continues north through relatively flat country before crossing into Canada at the Sweetgrass Scouts border crossing, one of the busiest truck crossings between the U.S. and Canada. But if you want to talk about Montana roads, you can't just talk about the interstates. You have to talk about going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park, because it's unlike anything else in the state or maybe anywhere in the country. Construction began in 1921 and took 11 years to complete at a cost of $2.5 million, a staggering sum for the time. The road stretches 50 miles across the park, crossing the Continental Divide at Logan Pass, elevation 6,646 feet. The engineering required was extraordinary. Workers dangled from ropes to drill holes and place explosives, carving the road out of sheer cliff faces. They built it to follow the contours of the mountains, minimizing switchbacks and visual impact, though the cost was enormous in both money and danger. The road has numerous tunnels carved straight through rock, stone arches that let you glimpse the landscape beyond, and precipitous drops that'll test your nerves if you're afraid of heights. Going to the Sun Road was dedicated on July 15, 1933, with a ceremony at Logan Pass attended by Blackfeet and Salish tribal members, government officials, and thousands of regular people who'd come to see this engineering marvel. It transformed Glacier from a relatively remote destination accessible mainly by train to a place where families could drive, at least in summer. The road is typically open from mid-June through mid-October, weather permitting, because snow at Logan Pass can accumulate up to 80 feet deep in winter. Clearing the road each spring is a massive undertaking, with plows working for weeks to cut through snowbanks that tower over the equipment. The road has been designated a National Historic Landmark, a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark, and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the only road in the country to hold all three distinctions. Driving it feels like threading a needle through paradise. On one side, sheer rock walls. On the other, drops of hundreds or thousands of feet to valley floors below. And all around, the mountains of Glacier, peaks and glaciers and alpine meadows and wildlife you won't see anywhere else. There's one more piece of Montana road history that's uniquely interesting: the state's relationship with speed limits. For most of Montana's history, there was no daytime speed limit on rural highways. You were expected to drive at a speed that was reasonable and prudent given conditions, but there was no specific number. This wasn't just an oversight. It was policy, a reflection of Montana's libertarian streak and the reality that with such vast distances and so few people, setting arbitrary speed limits seemed pointless and maybe even counterproductive. In 1974, President Nixon signed the Emergency Energy Highway Conservation Act in response to the oil crisis, establishing a national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. States that didn't comply would lose federal highway funding, so Montana had to go along. But Montanans weren't happy about it, and they found a loophole. The state set the fine for daytime speeding at $5, basically a joke, and these tickets didn't go on your driving record. Some truckers kept a stack of $5 bills in the glove compartment, ready to hand over with their license when they got pulled over, treating it more like a toll than a fine. In 1995, Congress repealed the national speed limit, and Montana immediately reverted to reasonable and prudent. This lasted until 1998, when the Montana Supreme Court ruled that the standard was unconstitutionally vague, that it didn't give drivers clear guidance on what was legal. So in 1999, Montana established a 75-mile-per-hour limit on interstate highways, the first posted daytime speed limit since 1995. In 2015, that limit was raised to 80 miles per hour, where it stands today. Interestingly, data suggests that accident rates were actually lower during the years Montana had no daytime speed limit than they were after limits were reimposed. Whether that's because drivers paid more attention, or because the kind of people who drove too fast for conditions did so regardless of posted limits, is an open question. But it speaks to Montana's complicated relationship with rules and regulations, a streak of independence that goes back to the frontier days when people made their own decisions about what was safe and what wasn't, and the law was something that happened somewhere else. Montana's got more than its share of ghost towns, places that boomed and busted, thrived and died, leaving behind only empty buildings and memories. Some have been preserved as state parks or tourist attractions. Others are slowly crumbling back into the earth, visited only by curious explorers and perhaps by ghosts, if you believe in such things. Bannack is the best preserved of Montana's ghost towns, and that's because the state took it over in 1954 and turned it into a state park. About 60 structures remain standing, most of which you can walk through and explore. The Hotel Meade, Originally built as a courthouse in 1875 and later converted to a hotel, is probably the most notorious building in town for paranormal activity. The hotel's reputation began over 100 years ago when a teenage girl named Dorothy Dunn drowned in a dredge pond along Grasshopper Creek. Shortly after her death, she appeared to her best friend, who had been with her when she died. Since then, people have reported seeing a young girl in a long blue dress on the second floor of the hotel. Cold spots appear and disappear without reason. The sounds of crying children echo through empty rooms. Some visitors report feeling an overwhelming sadness when they enter certain spaces, as if the building itself remembers tragedy. But the Hotel Meade isn't the only haunted spot in Bannack. The jail, Montana's first, is a small, claustrophobic space where Sheriff Henry Plummer once held prisoners before his vigilante execution. Some say you can feel a presence there, a sense of being watched. The Masonic Lodge, the Methodist church built in fear of an Indian attack that never came, the old schoolhouse, all of them have their stories, their strange occurrences reported by visitors and park rangers over the years. I've been to Bannack myself, walked those dusty streets on a sunny afternoon when I had some time between loads. Even in daylight, with tourists wandering around taking pictures, there's something eerie about the place. The buildings are frozen in time, showing their age but not quite falling apart. You can look through windows into rooms that still have furniture, wallpaper peeling from the walls, doorways that open onto nothing. It's like everyone just up and left one day, taking only what they could carry, leaving everything else to slowly decay. The town puts on Bannack Days every third weekend in July, a historical reenactment and celebration where actors play various characters from the town's past, including a particularly theatrical version of Sheriff Henry Plummer, who spins tales about vigilantes and conspiracy theories about why he was really hung. It brings the place to life, or at least gives the illusion of life for a weekend. The rest of the year it's quiet. The wind rattles through broken windows, dust settles, and the ghosts, if they're there, have the place to themselves. About an hour east of Billings, near the town of Crow Agency, sits the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, site of one of the most famous battles in American history. On June 25 and 26, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and elements of the 7th Cavalry clashed with Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. When it was over, Custer and 268 soldiers were dead. The native forces suffered about 100 casualties, though exact numbers were never recorded. The battlefield is a somber place. White marble markers stand where soldiers fell, scattered across the rolling hills. A monument honors the 7th Cavalry. In recent decades, markers were also placed for native warriors who died, a belated recognition that both sides suffered losses. Both sides believed they were defending their way of life. The Visitor Center offers exhibits and films explaining the battle from multiple perspectives, trying to do justice to a complex, tragic event that's been mythologized and distorted by a century and a half of storytelling. But beyond the history, the battlefield has a reputation for being haunted. Employees and visitors report all sorts of strange occurrences. The sounds of battle, horses galloping, men screaming. Cold spots that appear suddenly in the middle of summer. Apparitions of soldiers and native warriors seen riding along the ridgelines at dusk. One park employee reported seeing the ghost of a soldier in the visitor center late at night, a figure in cavalry uniform who walked the halls and then simply vanished. The Crow people, on whose reservation the battlefield sits, have always said the place is heavy with spirits. They reportedly called one park superintendent the Ghost Herder because he lowered the flag at dusk every evening, a ceremony they believed awakened the spirits of those who died there. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that the battlefield has a presence, a weight to it. Standing there, looking out over those hills where such violence occurred, it's hard not to feel something. Ghost stories aren't just entertainment in Montana. They're part of the state's identity, a way of processing and preserving history. The legends keep the past alive, make it relevant, give people a reason to care about places and events that might otherwise be forgotten. Every ghost story is really a story about loss, about lives cut short, about places that were once vital and are now empty. In a state where boom and bust has been the pattern for over a century, where towns appear and disappear based on the whims of commodity prices and resource depletion, ghost stories feel appropriate. They're a way of acknowledging that nothing lasts forever, that even the most prosperous places can fade, that the past has a way of lingering whether we want it to or not. Virginia City, unlike Bannack, never completely died. It lost its status as territorial capital in 1875, and when the gold played out, most people left. But a few stayed, and more importantly, the town got bought up by people who saw its value as a historical site. Today it's been restored and functions as a kind of living museum and tourist destination. You can walk the boardwalks, go into old buildings that now house shops and restaurants, watch melodramas performed at the historic Opera House. It's somewhere between a real town and a theme park, which gives it a different feel than Bannack's authentic decay. Other ghost towns are scattered all over Montana. Elkhorn, near Helena, where silver mining once employed hundreds of men. Garnet, in the mountains east of Missoula, preserved by the Bureau of Land Management and the Garnet Preservation Association. Accessible in winter only by snowmobile or cross-country skis. Comet, Coolidge, Pony, Castletown, each with their own stories of boom and bust, dreams and failures. Some are truly abandoned, accessible only by bad roads, dangerous to explore. Others have been stabilized or partially restored, turned into destinations for curious travelers and history buffs. For a trucker, these ghost towns are usually just signs passed on the highway, exit ramps leading to places that don't have much need for freight hauling anymore. But they're reminders that the Montana we drive through today is built on the ruins of other Montanas, other visions of what the state could be. The gold rush Montana of the 1860s, the copper boom Montana of the 1880s through 1980s, the homestead Montana of the early 20th century when the government gave away free land and thousands of farmers came, only to be driven out by drought and the Great Depression. Each era left its mark. Each boom built towns and infrastructure and communities. Each bust left behind empty buildings, broken dreams and stories that became legends. Montana's ghost towns aren't just historical curiosities. They're monuments to the American tendency to rush into things, to exploit resources without thinking about sustainability, to build entire communities around single industries without planning for what happens when the industry fails. They're cautionary tales, but they're also deeply human stories about people trying to make lives for themselves in a hard land, succeeding for a while, and then having to move on when circumstances changed. The western third of Montana is dominated by the Rocky Mountains, and nothing showcases that better than Glacier National Park. Established in 1910, Glacier covers over 1 million acres along the Canadian border in northwest Montana. It's part of the larger Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, which extends into Alberta, Canada. The park contains over 700 lakes, 2 mountain ranges, and at last count, about 25 active glaciers, down from an estimated 150 in the mid-1800s. Climate change is hitting Glacier hard, and scientists predict the glaciers could be gone entirely within a few decades, which would make the park's name a sad irony. Glacier is spectacular in a way that's almost overwhelming. Jagged peaks rise to over 10,000 feet. Alpine meadows explode with wildflowers in summer. Waterfalls cascade down sheer cliffs. Lakes so blue they don't look real reflect the mountains in their still surfaces. Grizzly bears, black bears, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, wolverines, lynx, and gray wolves roam the backcountry. It's one of the last intact ecosystems in the lower 48 states, a place where the full complement of native species still exists, where predator and prey relationships still function more or less as they did before European settlement. The Going to the Sun Road is the only route that crosses the park from west to east, and it's a journey through several different ecosystems as you gain elevation. You start in the cedar and hemlock forests along Lake McDonald on the west side, towering old-growth trees that survive the fires that regularly sweep through the region. As you climb, the trees transition to fir and spruce, and then at timberline, the trees thin out and disappear entirely, replaced by alpine tundra, low-growing plants adapted to high elevation and harsh conditions. At Logan Pass, you're above the tree line, surrounded by peaks, with trails leading to overlooks and hidden alpine lakes. The Hidden Lake Overlook Trail is popular, a moderate hike that takes you to a viewpoint above a pristine alpine lake surrounded by mountains. In late summer, you might see mountain goats right from the parking lot. These fearless white creatures with their curved black horns, perfectly adapted to life on cliff faces where other animals wouldn't dare to go. The east side of the park, descending towards St. Mary and the plains beyond, has a different character. The mountains still tower, but the landscape opens up more. The wind hits harder here, coming off the plains with nothing to stop it. The vegetation is sparser. You can see for miles, and off in the distance, if you look east, you can see where the mountains end and the Great Plains begin, a transition as dramatic as any border between states or countries. Glacier National Park gets around 3 million visitors a year, most of them concentrated in the brief summer season when Going to the Sun Road is open. The rest of the year, the park is mostly quiet, accessible only to those willing to brave winter conditions on snowshoes or skis. For truckers, the park is off-limits. The Going to the Sun Road has strict vehicle size restrictions. No vehicles longer than 21 feet or wider than 8 feet, including mirrors, are allowed between Avalanche Creek and Rising Sun from mid-June through Labor Day. That means no RVs, no trucks, nothing big. It's a road built for cars and motorcycles, designed to give access without overwhelming the park's delicate infrastructure. But you don't have to go to Glacier to see mountains in Montana. The Rockies extend south through the western part of the state, containing multiple mountain ranges. The Bitterroot Range along the Idaho border, the Sapphire Mountains, the Garnet Range, the Pintler Range. Each has its own character, its own peaks and valleys, its own mining history or logging history, or just wild, roadless areas where hardly anyone goes. The Continental Divide runs through these mountains, that imaginary line that separates watersheds. Water falling on the west side of the divide flows toward the Pacific Ocean. Water on the east side flows toward the Atlantic, mostly by way of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. The divide crosses Montana from northwest to southeast, passing through Glacier, crossing under Interstate 90 at Homestake Pass, continuing south toward Yellowstone. Speaking of Yellowstone, while most of that famous national park is in Wyoming, 3 of its 5 entrances are in Montana. The north entrance at Gardner, the northeast entrance near Cook City, and the west entrance at West Yellowstone all provide access from Montana. For truckers hauling loads to West Yellowstone or other gateway communities, the approach through Montana offers views of the Gallatin Range and the Madison Range, mountains that are less famous than Glacier's peaks, but equally impressive. The mountains of western Montana are why people come. They're why tourism is now one of the state's biggest industries. They're why retirees and remote workers are moving here, willing to deal with harsh winters and limited services in exchange for access to this kind of landscape. But there are also barriers. Interstate 90 has to climb mountain passes. U.S. Route 12 from Missoula to Helena goes over McDonald Pass. Highway 200 crosses Rogers Pass, which holds the record for the coldest temperature ever recorded in the lower 48 states, -70 degrees Fahrenheit on January 20, 1954. For a trucker, these mountains mean being ready for anything. Chains for snow and ice, watching your speed on downgrades, knowing where the runaway truck ramps are in case your brakes overheat, being aware that weather can change from clear to whiteout in 15 minutes. But they also mean some of the most beautiful drives you'll ever experience. When you crest a pass and the whole valley spreads out below you, mountains marching off to every horizon, sky so big it seems impossible, you remember why you started driving in the first place. It's not just about moving freight from point A to point B, it's about seeing the country, experiencing it firsthand, being part of the landscape in a way that people who just fly over it never understand. Montana's food culture reflects its history and landscape. This is beef country first and foremost. The eastern plains support vast cattle ranches, some of them hundreds of thousands of acres, where herds graze on grasslands that seem to go on forever. Montana beef has a reputation for quality, grass-fed or grain-finished, raised in a climate that's harsh enough to keep the cattle lean and strong. Steakhouses across the state serve cuts that would make a vegetarian weep with temptation, perfectly grilled, seasoned with nothing more than salt and pepper, because the meat doesn't need anything else. But if you want to talk about Montana food, you have to start with the huckleberry. Montana's official state fruit, designated in 2004, the huckleberry is a small purple berry that grows wild in mountain forests, particularly in the west and around Glacier. You can't commercially cultivate huckleberries. They grow where they want to grow, and harvesting them means going into the woods, often into bare country, and picking them by hand. It's slow, tedious work, which is why a pound of huckleberries can cost $20 or more. But they're worth it. Huckleberries have a flavor that's somewhere between a blueberry and a blackberry, sweet but with a tart edge, and a slight floral note that's hard to describe. They make incredible pies, jams, syrups. You can find huckleberry pancakes at diners, huckleberry ice cream at every roadside stand, huckleberry coffee, huckleberry barbecue sauce, huckleberry beer, huckleberry everything. It's almost a joke how ubiquitous they are. Montana's answer to Vermont's maple syrup or Idaho's potatoes, except huckleberries can't be farmed, which gives them a wild, local, you have to be here to get them quality that Montanans love. Then there's the pasty, pronounced with a short, a like pasty, not like the thing burlesque dancers wear. Pasties came to Montana with Cornish and Irish miners in the 1860s and became a staple in places like Butte where copper mining employed thousands of men. A pasty is a half-moon-shaped pie, a flaky crust filled with beef, potatoes, onions, and sometimes rutabaga or carrots, though traditional Butte pasties are pretty simple, just meat, potatoes, salt, and pepper. The genius of the pasty was that it was a complete meal in a portable package. Miners could carry them underground, reheat them on a shovel held over a candle, and eat them with their hands without plates or utensils. The thick crimped edge of the crust served as a handle, and some miners would hold the pasty by that edge, eat the rest, and then throw away the edge because their hands were too dirty from mining to safely eat it. Some folks say the edge was made thick specifically for that purpose, a built-in handhold that was meant to be discarded. Today, pasties are considered Montana comfort food, though finding an authentic Butte pasty can be challenging. Many of the old shops have closed as mining declined and the city's population shrank. But a few places still make them the traditional way, and Montanans who grew up eating pasties remain fiercely loyal to their favorite purveyors. Montana is also home to game meats. Elk, deer, antelope, bison, all hunted legally during designated seasons, and all showing up on dinner tables across the state. Elk stew, slow cooked with vegetables until the meat falls apart, is a cold weather staple. Bison burgers, leaner than beef and with a slightly sweeter flavor, are on menus throughout the state, particularly in tourist areas where visitors want to try something distinctly Western. Even venison, properly prepared, makes for excellent eating, though you have to know what you're doing or it can end up tough and gamey. And then there are Rocky Mountain oysters, which are exactly what you think they are. Bull testicles, removed during castration, breaded and deep-fried. Also called prairie oysters or Montana tenderloins, they're usually served with a dipping sauce, and the taste and texture are somewhere between fried calamari and chicken. Montana even has testicle festivals, or testy fests, in various towns, where thousands of people show up to eat them and drink beer and listen to music. It's the kind of thing that shocks outsiders and amuses locals, a reflection of the practical, waste not want not mentality that came from ranching culture, where nothing from a butchered animal goes to waste. Montana's food scene has evolved beyond just steak and potatoes, though. Cities like Missoula and Bozeman have developed sophisticated restaurant cultures with farm-to-table establishments, craft breweries, artisan bakeries, coffee roasters. You can find Thai food, Mexican food, Italian food, Indian food, sushi, all prepared with varying degrees of authenticity and success. But the classics remain. A chicken fried steak with country gravy at a small-town diner. A bowl of chili thick enough to stand a spoon in. Flathead cherries in season, sweet and juicy, grown in the orchards around Flathead Lake. Smoked trout from cold mountain streams. Homemade ice cream in summer. And everywhere always huckleberries. The food culture connects to the land in ways that are harder to find in more urban places. People hunt their own meat, pick their own berries, grow their own vegetables during the brief summer growing season. Farmers' markets thrive in summer, selling everything from fresh produce to artisan bread to local honey. There's a sense that food should come from nearby, should reflect what the land can provide, should connect you to place. This extends to beverages too. Montana has a thriving craft beer scene, with dozens of breweries scattered across the state making everything from IPAs to wheat beers to experimental brews, incorporating local ingredients like huckleberries or pine needles. The state's few wineries produce wines from cold hardy grapes or from fruits like chokecherries and huckleberries. And Montana distilleries make whiskey from local grains, continuing a tradition that goes back to the frontier days when every town of any size had a saloon, and every saloon served locally made spirits. Coffee, perhaps surprisingly, is taken seriously in Montana. Independent coffee shops have proliferated, roasting their own beans, training their baristas to pull perfect espresso shots, creating spaces that serve as community gathering spots. In a state where winter can last 6 months and darkness comes early, a good cup of coffee and a warm place to sit become essential to survival. For truckers passing through, finding good food can be a challenge. Truck stops serve the standard fare: burgers, sandwiches, fried chicken, maybe a salad if you're lucky. But if you know where to look, if you're willing to get off the interstate and poke around a bit, Montana has plenty to offer. Small-town cafes where the locals eat, serving breakfast all day and coffee that flows like water. Diners that still use cast iron skillets and real butter. Barbecue joints where the pitmaster smoked the meat himself and will talk your ear off about his process if you show interest. And every now and then, you'll stumble across someplace unexpected. A Thai restaurant in the middle of nowhere run by someone who moved to Montana to escape city life, but brought their cooking skills with them. Or a bakery producing croissants that would make a Parisian proud. The key is to stay open to possibilities, to not just stick to the chain restaurants and familiar options. Montana rewards curiosity. It rewards people who are willing to take a chance on a place that doesn't look like much from the outside. Some of the best meals I've ever had were in towns I'd never heard of, places that probably only have a few hundred residents, served by people who were genuinely happy to see a new face come through the door. Montana's population is small and spread out. The whole state has about 1.1 million people, and more than half of them live in just 7 counties. Yellowstone County, home to Billings, is the most populous with about 165,000 residents. Missoula County has around 120,000. Flathead County, which includes Kalispell and access to Glacier National Park, has about 110,000. After that, populations drop off quickly. There are counties in eastern Montana with fewer than 1,000 residents total, spread across areas larger than some East Coast states. Billings, the state's largest city, sits along the Yellowstone River in south-central Montana. It's a regional hub for commerce, healthcare, and services, serving not just its own population, but people from a wide radius who come there for things they can't get in smaller towns. The downtown is modest, a mix of old and new buildings, brick warehouses converted to lofts and offices sitting alongside modern construction. The city has an oil refinery, agriculture services, a growing medical center, and serves as a transportation nexus where I-90 and I-94 meet. Missoula, the second largest city, has a completely different vibe. The University of Montana dominates the town, bringing students, professors, researchers, and all the cultural amenities that come with higher education. There's a thriving music scene, art galleries, bookstores, coffee shops. The Clark Fork River runs through town, and the mountains rise on all sides, making Missoula feel more enclosed, more sheltered than Billings. It's a liberal enclave in a generally conservative state, known for environmental activism and outdoor recreation culture. Great Falls, the third largest city at about 60,000 people, sits along the Missouri River in north-central Montana. It's more working class than Missoula, more conservative than both Missoula and Billings, with an economy based on Malmstrom Air Force Base, agriculture, and energy. The city's name comes from the series of waterfalls on the Missouri that Lewis and Clark spent nearly a month portaging around, though dams have tamed the river now and turned those falls into hydroelectric power. Helena, the capital, is smaller than you might expect at about 32,000 people, but it's got history and charm. The downtown area around Last Chance Gulch retains its Old West character, with buildings from the mining boom days when Helena was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the country. The state capitol building, completed in 1902, is topped by a copper dome, a nod to the mineral that made Montana rich. The city sits in a valley surrounded by mountains, with access to good hiking, fishing, and winter sports practically from downtown. Beyond the cities, Montana is a place of small towns and rural communities. Towns like Havre, Glasgow, Miles City, Lewistown, each with their own character and challenges. Many of these towns are struggling with the same issues facing rural America everywhere. Young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, aging populations, economic bases that have shifted or disappeared entirely, inadequate health care and infrastructure. But they persist, held together by people who are deeply attached to place, who can't imagine living anywhere else despite the difficulties. The Native American reservations are their own worlds within Montana. The Blackfeet Reservation, along the eastern border of Glacier National Park, covers about 1.5 million acres and is home to around 10,000 enrolled tribal members. It's economically challenged, with high unemployment and poverty rates, but it's also culturally rich, with efforts to preserve the Blackfeet language and traditional practices. The Crow Reservation, home to the Apsahaluk people, covers about 2.3 million acres in south-central Montana. The tribe has been successful with energy development, leasing land for coal mining and oil and gas extraction, which has brought in revenue, but also created environmental concerns and disagreements within the tribe about how to balance economic needs with preservation of the land. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation, adjacent to the Crow Reservation, has taken a different approach, voting against coal development in favor of preserving air quality and traditional ways of life, even though this decision has meant foregoing significant potential revenue. It's the kind of choice that reveals different values, different visions of what matters most. The Flathead Reservation in northwest Montana is home to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. The reservation was open to homesteading in the early 1900s, which means today only about 20% of the land on the reservation is actually owned by tribal members, a legacy of misguided federal policy that tried to turn native people into yeoman farmers by breaking up communal lands. Montana's native populations face ongoing challenges: poverty, inadequate health care, missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, the intergenerational trauma of boarding schools and forced assimilation. But there's also resilience, cultural revitalization, pride. Powwows bring communities together. Language programs teach children the tongues of their ancestors. Artists and activists are ensuring that native voices are heard in conversations about Montana's present and future. The white population of Montana, meanwhile, is itself diverse. There are fifth- and sixth-generation ranching families whose roots go back to the homestead era. There are people whose grandparents or great-grandparents came from Finland or Norway or Germany or Italy to work in the mines. There are newcomers who arrived in the last decade or two, drawn by Montana's quality of life, outdoor recreation, and remote work opportunities. Each group has its own relationship to the land, its own sense of what Montana means and should be. Politically, Montana is conservative but with maverick tendencies. It tends to elect Republican governors and vote for Republican presidential candidates, but it's also sent Democrats to the U.S. Senate and has a history of supporting politicians who don't fit neatly into either party's box. There's a strong libertarian streak, a distrust of government authority, and a belief in self-reliance that sometimes manifests in surprising ways. Montana was one of the first states to allow women to vote in 1914, 6 years before the 19th Amendment. Jeanette Rankin, elected to Congress from Montana in 1916, was the first woman to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. The culture values toughness, independence, hard work. There's respect for people who can fix things with their own hands, who don't complain when conditions get difficult, who honor their word and help their neighbors. But there's also a growing tension between old Montana and new Montana, between people whose families have been here for generations and newcomers with money and different ideas, between resource extraction industries that have sustained communities for decades and environmental advocates who want to preserve wildlands and wildlife. These tensions play out in debates over land use, water rights, energy development, grizzly bear management, wolf populations, every issue that touches on how Montana's land and resources should be used and who gets to decide. It's the same kind of conflict playing out across the rural West, a struggle to define what these places should be in the 21st century. Driving through Montana as a trucker gives you a particular perspective on the state. You're not here on vacation. You're not stopping at every scenic overlook or spending hours hiking mountain trails. You've got a load to deliver, a schedule to keep, miles to cover. But that doesn't mean you don't notice things. In fact, spending hours at a time watching the landscape roll by, you notice things other people miss. You notice how the light changes as you drive east to west or west to east, the way morning sun hits the Rockies from the plains side, painting them gold and pink, or the way evening light makes the prairies glow amber. You notice the weather patterns, how storms build over the mountains and then sweep across the plains, how you can see rain falling 20 miles away, a gray curtain hanging from the clouds, and know you'll be in it soon. You notice the wind, constant companion on Montana highways, buffeting your trailer, making you fight the wheel a little more than usual, especially on high-profile loads. You notice the wildlife. Montana has more wildlife per square mile than almost anywhere in the lower 48 states, and that means you see animals other places have lost. Pronghorn antelope, the fastest land animal in North America, racing across the plains in groups. Mule deer and white-tailed deer in the river valleys and foothills. Elk in the mountains, sometimes massive herds of them crossing the highway at dusk, A sight that'll make you slam on your brakes and just watch, awestruck. Bison in Yellowstone, causing traffic jams when they decide to walk down the middle of the road, completely unconcerned with your schedule. And bears. Montana has both grizzlies and black bears, and while you're unlikely to see them from the highway, you're aware they're out there. When you pull into a rest area at night and get out to stretch your legs, you think about bears. When you see warning signs about bear activity, you pay attention. These aren't cartoon bears. They're apex predators that can weigh 600 pounds or more, run 35 miles per hour, and take your head off with one swipe of their paw. The fact that they're out there, sharing the landscape, adds an edge to Montana, a reminder that this isn't Disneyland. The weather is the biggest challenge. Montana has 4 seasons, and each one can be brutal in its own way. Spring brings melt and mud, with secondary roads turning into quagmires. Summer brings heat, but also afternoon thunderstorms that can drop hail the size of golf balls, crack windshields, dent body panels. Fall is gorgeous but brief. A few weeks of gold aspen leaves and crisp air before winter slams the door. Winter is when Montana earns its reputation. November through March, sometimes longer, you're dealing with snow and ice. Not the light dustings they get in places like Seattle or Portland. Real snow, measured in feet, accompanied by temperatures that drop below zero and stay there for days at a time. Wind chills of -30, -40, -50. Black ice on the highway, invisible until you're sliding. Whiteout conditions where you can't see 10 feet in front of your truck. Chain requirements on mountain passes. Jackknife trucks blocking lanes. Road closures that can last for hours or days. I've sat in my truck at a closed port on I-90 east of Butte, waiting for the highway patrol to reopen the road after a storm, heater running, watching snow pile up on the windshield, listening to the wind shake my trailer. There's nothing to do but wait. You can't fight Montana weather. You can only respect it and adapt to it. The truck stops and rest areas are lifelines. Montana doesn't have a lot of them, which means you plan carefully. The Flying J in Billings, the Conoco in Great Falls, the town pump locations scattered across the state. These aren't just places to fuel up and grab a sandwich. They're communities unto themselves, places where truckers gather, share information about road conditions, complain about dispatchers, tell stories. The clerks and waitresses know regulars by name. They'll tell you if a storm is coming or if there's construction ahead that the GPS doesn't know about yet. Rest areas are simpler but no less important. Montana maintains them well, even in winter, with heated bathrooms and vending machines. They're spaced out along the interstates, roughly every 50 to 80 miles, which is far enough that you notice when you miss one because you weren't ready to stop yet. In good weather, they're pleasant places to stretch your legs, walk around, maybe see a historical marker explaining something about the area. In bad weather, they're refuges, places to pull off and check your load, clear ice from your mirrors, warm up for a few minutes before pushing on. The loneliness of driving Montana can be overwhelming. Hours pass without seeing another person. The radio fades in and out, losing stations in the mountains. Cell service disappears for long stretches. It's just you and the road and your thoughts, which can be meditative if you're in the right frame of mind, or maddening if you're not. I've driven through Montana at night when the highway was so empty it felt post-apocalyptic, like I was the last person left in the world, my headlights cutting through darkness, mile markers ticking by one. But there's also a fierce beauty to it. Sunrise over the plains, with pronghorn silhouetted against the sky. The Rockies appearing on the western horizon as you drive I-90 from North Dakota, a promise of different terrain ahead. Thunderstorms building in summer, towers of clouds so tall they seem to go into space, with lightning flickering inside them like trapped fire. And the stars. My God, the stars. Pull into a rest area on a clear night in eastern Montana, away from any city lights, and look up. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of light. You can see satellites moving across the sky. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the northern lights dance on the horizon, green and pink curtains waving in a solar wind you can't feel. Montana tests you. It tests your equipment, your driving skills, your patience, your ability to cope with isolation and boredom and the sudden adrenaline spike of danger. But it also rewards you. It gives you experiences and views and moments of connection with the natural world that most people never get. And somehow, despite the challenges or maybe because of them, it gets under your skin. You find yourself looking forward to Montana runs. You find yourself taking the long way sometimes, choosing routes that aren't quite the most efficient, but that take you through country you want to see again. There's a community among truckers who regularly run Montana, an understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. We nod to each other at truck stops. We watch out for each other on the road, reporting hazards over the CB or calling in accidents. We share the knowledge that comes from experience. Which scales are most likely to pull you in, which way stations close at night, where to find decent food, which motels allow truck parking, where the speed traps tend to be, how early to chain up on a pass before the highway patrol closes it. And maybe beneath all of that, there's a shared appreciation for Montana itself, for the bigness of it, the wildness, the way it refuses to be tamed or made convenient or turned into something it's not. Montana doesn't care about your schedule. It doesn't care about efficiency or productivity or any of the things modern life values. It operates on its own terms, seasonal and cyclical and vast. And there's something deeply satisfying about that, about being reminded that the human world with all its hurry and noise is just a thin layer spread across something much older and more powerful. As I write this, it's late evening and I'm parked at a rest area somewhere in eastern Montana. The sun's gone down, but the western sky still holds onto some light, that long twilight you get in summer at this latitude. My load delivered, my next pickup not scheduled until morning. I've got time to just sit and think. Montana has changed in the years I've been driving through it. Bozeman has exploded with growth. California refugees and Silicon Valley remote workers driving up housing prices and changing the character of the town. Whitefish, near Glacier, has become a resort destination, with vacation homes and luxury developments. Even small towns are feeling the pressure, caught between needing economic development and wanting to preserve the qualities that made them attractive in the first place. The old extractive industries that built Montana are fading. The copper mines of Butte have closed, leaving behind toxic waste and environmental disaster. Coal mining continues but faces an uncertain future as utilities shift to natural gas and renewables. Oil and gas remain important in the eastern part of the state, but boom and bust cycles make for an unstable foundation. Logging, which once employed thousands, has consolidated and mechanized, with far fewer jobs than decades past. Tourism and recreation are filling some of the economic gaps, but they're different kinds of jobs, seasonal and often lower paying. There's tension about this, about Montana becoming a playground for rich people from elsewhere while locals struggle to afford housing and make ends meet. It's a version of the same story playing out in Jackson Hole, in Aspen, in Bend, in every western town that's beautiful enough to attract outside money. The native reservations continue to struggle with poverty and lack of opportunity, though there are also signs of hope. Language revitalization programs, cultural centers and museums telling native stories in native voices, tribal colleges providing education and job training, young people choosing to stay or return, working to build futures for their communities that honor tradition while embracing necessary change. Climate change is visible everywhere. The glaciers in Glacier National Park retreating year by year, forests stressed by drought, vulnerable to catastrophic wildfire, snowpack declining, which affects water availability for agriculture and ecosystems, warmer winters that allow bark beetles to survive and kill vast swaths of pine forest. These aren't abstract future predictions. They're happening now, changing the landscape in real time. But Montana endures. It adapts. It's done it before, through gold rushes and copper booms and homestead busts and everything else. The land remains, the mountains and plains and rivers that have been here far longer than any human presence. The people who love this place, native and newcomer alike, continue to find ways to live here, to make lives worth living, to build communities that matter. As truckers, we're just passing through. We see Montana in fragments, in the hours between loading and unloading, in the miles that tick by on the odometer. But maybe that perspective is valuable too. We see patterns that residents might miss, changes that happen slowly enough that locals don't notice until they're stark. We carry stories from other places, other parts of the country, and we can see how Montana compares, what makes it unique, what challenges it shares with everywhere else. If you've never driven Montana, if you've only flown over it or seen pictures or heard stories, I encourage you to find a reason to come. Rent a car, take your time, drive the back roads and not just the interstates. Stop in small towns, eat at local cafes, talk to people. Visit Glacier if you can, but also see the Badlands and the prairie and the ghost towns. Go to a reservation museum and learn some history that probably wasn't in your school textbooks. Walk a battlefield. Stand at the Continental Divide and think about how water on one side of that line flows to the Pacific and water on the other side flows to the Gulf of Mexico. And if you do get into trucking, if you find yourself running loads through big sky country, pay attention. Don't just zone out and count mile markers. Look at the landscape. Notice how it changes. Watch for wildlife. Think about the history, the stories embedded in the land. Montana rewards attention. It rewards curiosity. It punishes carelessness and hubris, but it rewards respect. The roads through Montana are more than transportation corridors. They're ribbons connecting past and present, urban and rural, resource extraction and preservation, different visions of what Montana means and could mean. Every trucker who drives them is part of that story, linking Montana to the rest of the country, moving goods that keep communities alive, burning diesel and hours to connect supply with demand. But we're also witnesses. We see things. We remember things. And in some small way, we carry Montana with us when we leave, pieces of landscape and experience that lodge in memory, that shape how we see other places, that remind us there are still parts of this country that are wild and hard and beautiful in ways that resist easy description. So here's to Montana, to the mystery and the mountains, to the untamed roads and the people who live beside them, to the ghosts in Bannack and the warriors at Little Bighorn and the miners who died underground in Butte and the homesteaders who lost everything to drought, to the native peoples who were here first and are still here, to the cattle ranchers and wheat farmers and everyone trying to make an honest living from honest work, to the truckers who keep rolling through, no matter the season or weather, because the load has to get there and the road doesn't care about your excuses. This is Montana, big sky country, the last best place as some call it, though that's a marketing slogan as much as a description. It's a place of extremes and contradictions, harsh and gentle, isolated and connected, ancient and brand new all at the same time. It's a place that's hard to explain to people who haven't been here, a place that maybe shouldn't be explained, just experienced. And now, as the last light fades from the sky and the stars begin to emerge, as the temperature drops and the wind settles into its steady nighttime rhythm, I'm going to button up, get some sleep, and be ready for tomorrow's drive. There's always another road ahead, always another load waiting, always another sunrise over these Montana plains, painting the world gold one more time. Safe travels, friends, and maybe I'll see you out there on the road.